Hi folks, welcome to Governance Training for CRCs. I'm Andrew Huffer and today I'm joined by the most wonderful John Denton. Welcome back, John.
Good day, Andrew. Pleasure to be here again.
And today we're blessed by the presence of Lisa Fisher, who's Chair of the Merredin CRC. Welcome aboard, Lisa.
Hi Andrew, thanks for having me back.
Absolutely, fantastic to have you back. Today we're going to be looking at team development. So we're now into episode 6 of our 10 episode series. I want to do a quick recap of what we covered last week in episode 5 of Managing Priorities. So we looked at high payoff activities, the areas where you really need to focus to make sure you're getting best value for your time as a board member of your CRC. We also looked at tips for running effective meetings, how you can make the most of your time together in the joy of that meeting space. And we also talked about ways to measure the results of your work, to make sure you're really clear on what are the goals that you're there to achieve, how you're measuring success, and making sure that you make any adjustments as you go along. This week in episode 6, our focus is going to be looking at performance coaching. So we're looking at team development and we're going to look at how you can develop your staff using performance coaching. We're also going to talk about making sure you've got a plan in place to develop your board, to make sure they're coming through and you've got continuously new talent and new skills coming on, being available to your board. And we'll also talk a bit about the recruiting process. What do you need to have in place to make sure you're getting the best staff and that you're getting best value from the time you're putting into them? We've got an action-packed episode today. John, if I can get you to lead off, please. Once to give us a bit about staff management, but also to take us through performance coaching as a starter.
Sure, thank you, Andrew. Performance coaching in the dark ages used to be called performance management, but most organisations now accept that, and there is data available that proves that coaching rather than managing people in teams is more productive and yields much greater performance and results. So with performance coaching, it's coaching versus managing. Coaching is about looking at future potential in people, whereas performance management used to be about looking at past performance. So what I'm going to recommend that you do is change your attitude and your thinking around managing for performance and start talking and thinking about coaching for performance. All high performance teams have very good coaches, and so the first thing that the coach needs to do is set some goals. So identify what the goals are for the individual or for the team, and then get some clarity around those goals. And then look at developing a work plan to achieve the goals. And one of the things is to look at some options. So again, coaching is about asking questions and not telling. Andrew, I know you're pretty big on these sort of things. It's rather than give people the answer all the time, which managers quite often tend to do, and because we know and we've been there and we've done it before, we will tend to give people the solution, but there's a lot more benefit to be got from actually getting people to come up with their own options and then working on the goals and working through to developing them and growing them. So any comments on that? Absolutely.
We've found we've got the cafe and catering business, and we find with our staff there, if staff come up with an idea or a solution, then they're going to be a lot more committed to that than if it was one of our ideas. And once they get, I guess, a bit of support to see it through, then we're going to see some fantastic results that they'll just take through and work with all the time. And it can be from just little things like having an A-frame blackboard out the front where we have, say, a saying of the day or something like that. I used to do that because, you know, my great wit and good charm used to come up with some earth-changing type of things. But you know, I'm not there all the time. And so we had one staff member who during a lunchtime just went and downloaded a couple of sayings. And then since then she's been on fire, and people come in each day just to see what's on the blackboard. And that's been through basically handing over a bit of the opportunity for her to run with it. She's got some operational guidelines to work within, what's appropriate and what's not, and off she goes. And it's become a real magnet for people there that just made it quite clear that because it's her thing, the thing she runs with, it works like a charm.
Absolutely. If people come up with their own options and solutions, then they're going to have more ownership of it. And that's pretty key. Plus, they may come up with things that you'd never thought of anyway. So, like in that particular case. And Lisa, can you give us some examples of similar things in your CRC?
We've set KPIs for our staff, and we have a weekly meeting we have trainees, as you all know, out there in the CRC world. So the trainees are, as Andrew said, the best way to develop a young person or a trainee is to give them high-powered questions, not answers. Get them to think for themselves. So the weekly meeting is a really important one because it gives them direction for a start.
Yeah, and that's exactly a coaching approach, is to give them questions and get them to work out how they're going to do things. Then they learn and remember. And you mentioned KPIs, which is a critical one. So it would be the same in Andrew's case as well. You're setting targets for people to achieve. So you're basically agreeing what the expectations are. So I'm going to let you run with this, and this is your idea, but this is how we're going to measure the success of that idea and what we expect as a result.
Yeah, never assume that people know what they're doing. If you don't give people some sort of direction, but also allow them the room to grow, that's important in our organisation.
That's why you need a regular reporting basis as well. So once you've agreed the expectations and set the targets and the outcomes that you want, then agree with the person how they're going to report back and how they're going to be measured. And
yes, which
you
the
give them
weekly
feedback.
meeting covers, and then why they haven't performed that task, or are they not able to, or is it just a time problem? So it's addressing all those issues in that meeting.
Yeah, so review regularly, and if people aren't achieving, it's usually one of three things. It's either that they don't have the skills to the level that are required, or they don't have the knowledge of how to do it, or it's an attitude problem. They don't want to do it.
Yeah,
and that's the hardest one, of course, to address.
Definitely.
So any comments on that?
I think actually nailing that expectations one really helps with that. And we do it in a I guess a two-way approach, is by talking about these are the expectations we have of you in your role, but we also turn around and say, what do you need from us to be able to achieve that? So it becomes a two-way street. So it just doesn't, again, like you said earlier, it's not us telling people what to do, but it's saying this is what we expect of you, what do you need from us, to make sure they can't go blaming things like on the environment, or they don't have the right tools, or that sort of stuff. And the other thing, I know you've seen it work and that works for us as well, is getting people to write down those expectations. So it becomes not something they just, oh yeah, we talked about and agreed on, but I think having it written down really adds some power to that and adds some strength to it, and it becomes a written commitment, like a signed document.
Yeah, I like the way Lisa explained it, because it needs to be a formal process and something that's done the same way all the time over a regular period of time. But coaching is a day-by-day ongoing thing. You know, if you watch a game of football, I don't know if anyone watched, there was a Fremantle Dockers game, I hate to mention them, but it was a good example. One of the players, I can't remember his name at this point, but he stuffed up on the field badly and he was pulled off. And Ross Lyon came down from the coaching box, and by the time the guy had got to coming off the pitch, Ross Lyon was down there and eyeballing him and got him eye to eye, and he gave him feedback.
Very assertive feedback, I believe.
So, you know, and that feedback, positive and negative, should be done all the time. Don't leave it until the weekly review or the quarterly review or whatever. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, I find you need to deal with things immediately. Otherwise, a moment passes and it's pointless trying to...
It's about coaching rather than managing, and the whole goal and the whole reason for doing this is to improve performance of the whole team, not just the individual, and to grow them as individuals as well.
And don't degrade someone. One of the worst things you can do as a leader or someone in a position of power is to degrade or put someone down. So do it in a manner that's constructive and assertive.
It's about seeing the potential in people and believing that they can do better. And that can be quite a mindset change for some people, to really believe that their people can do better. But that's where it's got to start.
Absolutely. And one of my, I guess, favourite videos I watch when it comes to thinking about teams and how they work together is by a fellow called Tom O'Toole from the Beechworth Bakery, and he sort of puts in that scenario, he puts the statement forward about, my staff don't sort of wake up in the morning and think, what am I going to stuff up on him today? They're coming in trying to do the right thing. So that's what his attitude's always about.
Exactly right. So it's all about attitude. So it's all about coaching, and it's all about having a formal process. So that's great. Now let's talk a little bit about succession planning.
We'll probably make the switch now and focus more about succession planning for the board, but I think this can equally apply to staff members as well. And I think for succession planning for the board is so important, especially from a CRC perspective, where, at least in my understanding, it's kind of often a challenge to get people onto a board or a committee, especially in rural communities.
That's correct, Andrew. I was, as I've mentioned before, was thrown in at the deep end. So not only did I have no committee experience, but I had no chair experience at all. But I have worked in management in business, so I've taken those experiences into my position. It is difficult because no one really wants to be responsible for the whole team. So I guess it's about helping people transcend into asking them the questions, saying, well, I may not be here in 12 months' time, so can we start looking at someone stepping up to my position and maybe restructure the executive committee, or look at someone that might think, well, this person could be good for the job, and then train them accordingly.
Absolutely. I reckon that's a great way to approach a succession plan, is being really clear on what are the positions we're going to need to have in place, and who's got some of those core skills that we could utilise. And in the previous episode we talked about those high payoff activities and the specific skills that are needed on a board. I think it's thinking about who are the type of people that we need to bring into a specific position. And just to, I guess, reinforce that, to me it's starting to think about if we're going to encourage people to get involved in a committee or board, that they don't think it's going to be just drag on forever. So to me it's thinking about making quite clear this is only for a fixed term, perhaps 2 or 3 years, and also to be quite clear on these are the skills we're looking for you or from you to provide to this board.
Yeah.
And with that, I think there's some opportunity as well to provide some sort of incentive to develop your board members, to look at where are some training opportunities for them, so that they actually walk away with some better skills than when they came into the board. And certainly, Lisa, from hearing your experience, that's what I'm hearing you've been able to do.
Oh, definitely. I've learned so much even about our own business, which has been fantastic. The skills I've achieved and the training I've been given through the CRCs, I would recommend my position to anyone really. And the people I'm meeting, being able to come onto this panel. So it's not all bad and it's not all meetings, and it's really a great opportunity, and I took it and ran with it. So hopefully anyone out there hearing my story would be happy to take on my role, which they will be doing at the end of this year.
And there'll be big shoes to fill, I'm sure.
Oh, well, hopefully.
Indeed.
Hopefully they see it that way.
But with the skills you're going to provide them, they'll be able to slot straight into there.
Definitely. And we've got very talented people on our committee. You've got to grow that talent, as we discussed before. So I find what chairs often do, and this is a fault of chairs, is that they don't include their vice chair enough. The opportunity should be for that vice to step up into my position, really.
Yeah.
That would be the perfect scenario.
So to me, it sounds almost like the chair should also have a bit of a, I guess, a mentor and coaching role to bring that person along with them.
Yes, I would recommend that to anyone who's in the vice position, is to run alongside the chair, not literally, and learn as much as needs to be learnt, because there are responsibilities there and you don't want to pretend that they're not.
Yeah, and to do that look over their shoulder type approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're not although you're the top of the pyramid, that doesn't mean to say that you don't work as a team.
Absolutely. John, your views on this?
Yes, I think it's very important that the vice chair is someone who has aspirations to become the chair.
Yep.
And the chair does do that mentoring. And one of the things that I did, I'll tell you a funny story about vice chairs.
It's got to be funny.
It's very funny.
Okay.
I'll laugh.
It was a mistake that I made, but one of the things that I started doing was actually giving that vice chair things to do that I would normally do at meetings and things like that. So start giving them tasks and roles so that they start to get a feel for what's going to be happening. The mistake I made was that I was coming up to the end of my term, so I was 3 or 4 months away from handing over. And when I started talking in detail about how that was going to happen to the vice chair, he said, "But it's not for another 15 months. And I said, "No, it's only 3 months. And he had thought, so when he took the vice chair role, he thought I'd got 2 years to go, when in fact I'd only got 1 year to go. So again, it's that induction and that communication process up front, make sure everybody understands what's going on.
Yeah.
But yes, the grooming and the handing over. Do you, on your board, does the president stay on as past president?
It hasn't been that way in the past, and given that it's also new to me, even though it's been 3 years, I think my committee is hoping I stay there. I would like to still be involved with the CRC, so yes, that would be even if it was for only 6 months, at least it gives that handover period for the vice chair to step up and not feel like they're floundering. But I have to say, don't be afraid to make mistakes. I've done it all. I'm really I don't mind admitting to mistakes, but don't be afraid to make those mistakes just because it might be a bit daunting to take the position on. Have a go, basically.
People who haven't made mistakes haven't made anything, typically. I can't remember whose quote that was, but
I thought it was John Denton's.
But certainly on our board, the outgoing president stays on as the immediate past president, and then there is that opportunity for some mentoring and ongoing support.
Yeah, I guess my 2 bobs worth on this is not to be afraid to invest in some of your board members to develop their skills. And again, I'll go back to my friend Tom O'Toole, one of his great quotes. He was investing a lot of time in training in his staff in a small local bakery, actually, was his business. And he had people come up and sort of say, well, what if you train them and they just go? And he just looked at him and said, well, what if they don't and they stay? So I thought it was a great, oh my God type moment.
Don't see it in the negative. I have to say too, it's really difficult for me to say that I would be stepping back, because I enjoy doing what I'm doing. I like the team I work with. But as you say, I think there needs to be a time limit on it. Other people disagree with me on that, but I feel that it needs to be looked at it with a fresh mind, a different thought process, and sometimes it can get stale. And unfortunately, a lot of chairs don't want to step aside. It's not productive. So we're moving into a different era with the CRC, so perhaps looking at someone younger too to take on that position and mentor is my advice.
Yes, it's a very valid point. Even in business, it's now acknowledged that it's healthier to have 10 or 15% staff turnover per annum than to have 0 staff turnover. In the old days, it was thought if you had 0 staff turnover, it was a good thing, because you obviously had a good business. but now the accepted best practice is around about 10 or 15%, because you get the fresh ideas and the newness and enthusiasm and things like that. So, and it's very true with chairs. You need that turnover to keep the ideas coming.
And it's stressful. I mean, you don't want to be continually being under any sort of... the commitment can take its toll depending on what's happening in that CRC. So just remember that you have to look at if your members are getting a bit tired or a bit long in the tooth. Both of those are...
They can stay on the board in other roles though.
And they're productive on the board.
Yeah. And the other thing you mentioned was youth and getting younger people involved. I'd be interested to hear from either of you if you've got any sort of strategies or ideas, because that is an issue with associations and not-for-profits generally, is that it tends to attract the older people. How do you get young people involved?
Just from my experience, or the way I would look at it, is going and talking to people in schools, year 11, 12, even younger. I think the younger the better, developing leadership skills. To me, this has been the most wonderful, and country areas do that. They give you the ability to be in a position that you would never or not normally be in. So I would grasp that opportunity if it was to come up for someone young. And
that's exactly what I'd be really pushing and promoting is the opportunities that being on a board would provide you with, especially as somebody starting out from school. Like having those sort of skills, that I reckon they'd set you up really well to have your own business or to get in other businesses, as you'd be really sought after as a staff member if you had that sort of approach, for sure.
And something I just saw on television this morning, and the headmasters or headmistresses were handing over to their students for the day, and those students were so articulate for 14, 15-year-olds, and people just don't regard young people as being switched on. They are. So take that on board.
Absolutely. And to me, I think it's having some flexibility for your CRC as well. So you don't just go, we have meetings at 6 o'clock on Monday, first Monday of the month or anything like that. It's thinking about, well, is that going to enable some of these young guys to come along? Those sort of things. So to really think about, is our structure actually helping younger guys come in? And like my wife's from a small country town, so am I, and they keep, a lot of people there keep saying, oh, we need to have more young people in the town, but when they get there, they don't let them into things and get them involved in that sort of stuff, because the old families run the town. So I think there's got to be a willingness to embrace that sort of change, and even when you mention that staff turnover thing, we find getting new people into our business helps break up some of the cliques so that can develop with some of the staff. It becomes a little club rather than a business, and for us as managers, we're always trying to keep it as focused on the business, not a club.
In the previous episode as well, we talked about low payoff activities and delegating some of those. One of the things that we've done on a board that I'm on is that we've got those younger people in for work experience. So we've given them things to do, and that's freed up the executive officer from some of the more mundane tasks, low payoff activities, and it's given some young person some experience of an association, a not-for-profit, and given them some work experience. So it's win-win all round.
Yeah.
I'll just recap a bit more on succession planning now. So we talked about the value of fixed skills, and we talked about some of the skills needed and to develop our board members. And Lisa, you mentioned the importance of developing people through the ranks so they're ready to take on the position when required. And we also talked about the importance of mentoring coaching. So if they're looking over your shoulder, letting them know what happens and how and why, so when they come into a new role, they've got that degree of confidence to take it on. I thought it would now be a good time to, I guess, make a switch again to think about, if we're bringing new people into our organisations, how do we go about it? And I think the recruitment process is one of the critical things that we need to get right in a CRC to make sure we get it, as much as possible, get it right the first time. John, could you take us a bit through that now, please?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. This is one of my hobby horse things in businesses as well, is the recruitment process, because the important thing about those two words is the process part. It's a process, and a lot of organisations, not-for-profits and even businesses go about recruiting, but they do it so infrequently that they don't have a well-documented process that they follow. and more these days it's critical not only to get the right person, but also in case there's any comeback later on about why you took that person on and not somebody else and things like that. So it's critical that it's a process, and it starts with identifying the skills that you need, for whether it's staff or board. And I recommend for any organisation that you create a skills matrix. So you set up usually a spreadsheet, and down the vertical column you put all the different roles and tasks that are required to be done in the organisation. And then across the top on the horizontal axis you put the skills that are required, the qualifications that are required, any special tickets. I don't think CRCs need forklift truck drivers, but you know, you never know. But if a role requires that, then it gets put in there. So now you've got this matrix of the positions and the skills required. And then go through and identify, well, in this role at the moment it's Lisa as chair. The chair needs this particular skill. How do we rate Lisa out of 5 or 10 on that particular skill? And if you go through and do that for every position and all the skills, you've got a complete picture on one sheet of the skill set of the organisation.
It's a great
And then
idea.
you can see where the holes are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then you can identify training needs, but you can also identify that if you're recruiting someone, if someone leaves or if you've just got extra work on, you can very easily see what skills are required for that person. And then of course that gets translated into the position description and becomes part of the recruitment process. So any thoughts on that, Lisa?
I think it's a great idea. We haven't implemented anything like that, and as you say, when you've got staff or people for a long period of time, you tend to, you forget. It's a bit like doing a program of some sort. If you're away from it, you don't necessarily remember what you're doing. So yes, the matrix is a wonderful idea. Love to use it.
Yes, and you made a good point there. I've got a client at the moment who's had an employee leave after 10 years, and the person, because they left quite quickly and unexpectedly, it's now obviously left a hole.
Mm-hmm.
And that person's manager is now stepping in and doing that person's role, and it's been a real eye-opener for them, because he's saying, gee, I didn't know that he did this and he didn't know that he did that. And so it's really now, you know, there was no skill set identified for that particular role because it was 10 years ago. So their process has been a little bit slack. So make sure that doesn't happen with the CRC. So create the skills matrix, and then identify if you're going to source people internally, externally. It may not apply so much internally to a CRC because you don't have an abundance of people, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But roles should always be advertised, in my opinion, internally and externally. And whether it's an internal application or an external one, the process should be the same. So if you've got somebody internally applying for a role, they should go through exactly the same process and selection criteria as anybody externally. So there's no arguments afterwards. Have I laboured that point enough?
One thing I want to labour a bit more is, I think in that example you talked about with that person leaving, there may be a short-term gap that you need to fill, and that's where you could perhaps get a contractor in on a short-term contract to fill that gap. So that may be another opportunity to bring into your recruiting process as well.
Yeah, good point.
That's a good point.
Thanks.
So the first thing with the recruitment process is, once you've identified the skill set required, is to look at the other selection criteria for the role as well. And again, if you've got good position descriptions in place for the different roles, then these sort of things should be ongoing and just updated as you go. But think about what the selection criteria are, what kind of person, what kind of skill set, what kind of experience. And of course, one of the things is that you need, I recommend that you have a recruitment policy, and that needs to cover off things like equal opportunity, no discrimination and things like that, so that the whole thing is fair and equitable and can be seen to be that. then set up a selection panel. So who is going to be involved in making the decision? Who is going to be involved in the interview process? So again, it shouldn't be just a random thing or whoever's available at the time, but it should be well thought out in advance. And now I'll get from you some interview tips, because again, I find a lot of board members, even a lot of managers in business, find that interview process quite tricky. So I don't know if either of you got some experiences you'd like to talk about on that front. Lisa, you're smiling.
I had experience from my days as in management, but we found ourselves in a position where one of our board members applied for the job, and we had to make sure that it was fair and just, and didn't look like because it was standing out that it would be fairly obvious who was going to get that job. So we actually brought in someone from outside who's totally neutral, and our executive committee were the ones that performed those interviews after we'd advertised in the paper and internally as well.
Good point. An external person is a good way to go.
Absolutely. And for me, I think one of the things that works well in just really finding out if the people we're interviewing have actually got demonstrated practical experience is asking them to provide examples of when. So if you've talked about your selection criteria, then ask people can you give me an example of when you've had to deal with a challenging customer and get a good outcome for both you and for the CRC. What were the things you did? What made it work? What might you change in the future? So then you really know when they're actually in the position that they're actually going to be able to do the job, rather than being able to sort of have a more theoretical background.
Yeah, we've used that method to give an example, so it does work.
Yeah, and have all those questions and scenarios documented so that you ask everybody the same set of scenarios and set of questions.
Yeah.
And record the outcomes and the answers. Because again, if you're ever challenged afterwards, you can show that you've been fair and equitable. But then you can also do a good comparison.
Yeah.
So, and what about following up referees? I'm amazed how many people don't do that.
Yeah, I find it really. We had an instance at our work just recently where we employed someone and we didn't get a phone call, nothing to ask about that. So just with CRCs, yes, we do follow up, and it's interesting what you do find out from those referees.
A great question that we often use, and a lot of people are a bit hesitant about providing referee checks and that sort of thing nowadays. A great question I ask is, do you have any tips on how you'd manage this person for me? Because people like being asked for their recommendations, and it appeals a bit to their ego. Then you'll often open the door up a bit and they'll say, well, actually, there's one thing you might need to think about. And it might just give you that little sense of, okay, if I do take John on ahead of Lisa, then I'm going to have to be really clear on this with John. Whereas Lisa, they didn't mention anything. She was perfect for the job. So,
that's me.
But it's just such a great question, I think. Do you have any tips on how this person should be managed? And they might just say, no, I don't. But 8 times out of 10, we'll find, actually, there's one thing you need to be looking out for.
Great question.
I think that's a great question. And again, when following up referees, have all the questions written down so that you ask all the referees the same questions and record the answers, and then you can do a comparison as well. So, but that's a great question. I've never used that one.
No.
The one I always ask is, would you employ this person again? And that usually tells you quite a lot.
Or have you had any problems with this person? What could you pass on?
But as Andrew was saying again as well,
that can be a bit confronting.
Yeah, and some people are very careful about what they say if they get phone calls these days. Have you ever known anyone give a poor referee?
Yeah.
Yeah?
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, we've had some who just said, under any circumstances, do not employ this person.
Oh, right.
And so it showed some flaws in our interview process, because obviously we haven't asked the right question if they were able to get to that point. So it's a bit of a challenging one because you've got to question then, were there some issues between the employer and the candidate that we didn't pick up on, or under what circumstances did they leave, and all those sort of things. So yeah, there have been times where people say, don't go there. So we need to really go back to, not quite to square one, but go back and ask some more questions both about the process, because you said the process is really important, and the person.
That's great, and I think it's also important when you're interviewing people and you're not taking them on to give them some feedback and advice and some indication as to how they could do better in the future, maybe.
Yep.
And when we've done that ourselves, it makes a difference in a small town, because you know these people generally, and we offer for them to come in even and do some volunteer work with us and maybe pick up their skills if that was one of the issues that they had. So it's a good. We always give feedback. We don't let anyone flounder or think that they're not important just because they didn't obtain the job.
Absolutely, it's great. And as you say, it's you want your organisation to be well thought of in the community. And so if you do the right thing by everyone in those sort of situations, then you get a good reputation. And then you start to become an employer of choice because you're a good place to work and you deal with people on in a very nice manner.
Even though I did have a bread roll thrown at me in the aisle of the supermarket because I didn't employ them.
Did it taste good?
No, I don't eat bread.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so there's more than one way
to skin a cat.
to recruit.
I'll leave some feedback to you. The bread roll feedback test.
Yeah.
Okay, so the point here is have a process, have it well documented, have the documents in place like the position descriptions, and so what are the essential criteria and desired criteria of people and so on, and then go through the same process with every candidate and be consistent. And then you'll get the best person, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next thing I want to talk about is managing the manager. Now, Lisa, I know you want to talk about this, and but it's an interesting one. Like, it sounds pretty obvious thing to do, but as you and I both know from experience, it doesn't always get done. Would you like to tell us your experience before I tell you my experience?
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
You
what
tell
happens,
great stories.
Yeah, you start the
And
ball
they're funny
rolling.
too.
What happens, what can happen, and what I've seen happen with not-for-profits and boards is that it gets to the point where, because people are so time poor, and we're all volunteers on the board, and you've got this paid employee over there, or paid employees, but you've got the paid employee, the manager, executive officer, or coordinator, and they tend to get left with doing the work, and then they tend to get left with doing the managing, and then if something doesn't happen, they end up managing the board and driving the board. So now you've got the tail wagging the dog, so to speak. And I've seen this happen in practice, and it can be pretty disastrous for the organisation. So this is where a good, strong chairperson can really make a difference, because they need to come in and take control and make sure that it's the board who are the employer and the employees working for the board. So and the way to do that is to, using the performance coaching thinking, is to sit down with the manager and clearly identify what the board's expectations are of that person. And again, it comes back to a good position description, good KPIs and measures, and the skill set. But it's also about growing and developing that person as well, but agree the expectations.
It's interesting, just on that point, we had a situation where our coordinator was given her performance review for the year, and she came back to us with one of the expectations was that we weren't controlling the situation. She felt she was leading too much. And we were a bit blasé about it, thinking that she was just doing a great job, so we didn't need to interfere or step in at any point. So it just brought us back to reality as what our position is as a board.
And I think it comes back to what we said earlier, that expectations is a two-way street. So it's about what you expect from your staff members and also what they expect from you. So that's clearly laid out and agreed on.
Yeah.
It can happen. I've seen it where, and I was one of them, a group of us got together outside of a board meeting and we sat down and said, hang on a minute here, you know, who's working for whom here? Because we were in the situation where we felt like it was the other person's association, not ours. And so fortunately we had a good strong chairperson come in and they took control and got things back. And it wasn't for any malicious intent, it was just that the person had basically evolved into that position. So set the boundaries, get a good position description and an employment contract in place and make sure it's all locked down. And then set up a reporting procedure. So like you said with the review, you know, how often are you going to go through the management report? How often are you going to sit down with the person and review their performance against the KPIs? And obviously annually is when you would typically do the performance review and the salary review and everything. But like the performance coaching, it's got to be an ongoing, you know, day by day, week by week.
And we do that.
Process, and you're doing that, yeah. So any other tips from Andrew or Lisa on that?
Not at this point.
No, I think we've really covered that. When you, like I said, couple it with the performance coaching, I think it becomes a pretty good package for everyone being clear on what you're looking for, where the boundaries are, and making sure that gets reported back on both sides pretty regularly. Yeah.
Okay. So it's a little trap that organisations can fall into. Hopefully now you won't.
And probably one last thing on that is just picking up on what Lisa said earlier, is deal with things in the moment. When something comes up,
that's it.
Deal with it in a timely manner. Don't just let it sort of drag on, because it'll just fester and become probably a bigger issue than it actually needs to be.
Always. That's in any walk of life.
Yes.
Really.
That's right.
Absolutely. Do the Ross Lyon thing. Go down there and eyeball the guy. Andrew, sorry, had to bring it back to football.
Oh yes, tragic. Okay, I think we've had a fantastic episode here today. And just to quickly recap about what we've covered, we started off talking about the importance of performance coaching, and one of the key things you said there, John, was working towards future performance, making sure that people are really focused on where we're going and what we need from you in the future, and not getting too caught up on what happened in the past. We also talked about the importance of succession planning, getting people ready to take on a new role and giving them the support to be able to do that. We mentioned we work through the recruiting process and the things we need to have in place to make sure it actually is a process, as John mentioned, so that we do end up with the right people on place working for our CRC. And finally, we just talked a little bit about staff management in managing the manager. So from here on, again, we'd really encourage you to go back through the workbook, review the episode and think about what are the 3 key things that you want to be able to put in place from this episode, and perhaps go and talk to some of your other colleagues and board members and perhaps even staff about that. Remember, MSO has heaps of fantastic resources for CRCs. Here are just a few that we recommend that are most relevant to today's episode. Coming up next, we're talking about assessing board performance. So we're looking forward to having you join with us again on that in episode 7. I'd like to say a big warm thank you to Lisa for joining us today, coming here all the way from Merredin. Really appreciate your time and effort and what you've put in and helped make this such a great episode. So thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for having me, and I've enjoyed talking to you. So if you ever need any help, contact the Merredin CRC. We'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Fantastic. I'll take you up on that offer.
Okay.
And thanks again, John, for joining us, and some great insights as always.
Pleasure, Andrew. Look forward to the next episode.
Wonderful. We'll see you then for episode 7. Thanks, everyone.